Thank you, Zoltan, for an extraordinary presentation based on a very rich and valuable book on the Greek crisis. What struck me about your presentation, it really did remind me of where we are, or where we were in the African context in the 60s and 70s, when we had a period of growth. Many African economies went into a crisis in the 70s. And the first structural adjustment program in the mid-1980s sounds almost identical to what's being done to the Greek economy. And it did fundamentally transform African economies and set them up for what is called the Africa Rising phenomenon now, which is 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African economies, but it's based on the resource curse. So demand, especially from China, is what is driving it. So it's a kind of restructuring that did set these economies up for growth, but it was based on deindustrialization. And if Africa didn't have this massive resource base, these economies wouldn't be where they are now. And now that with China coming off the boil, many African economies, especially the South African economy now, are facing a very serious crisis. And more than 50% of South Africa's exports are raw materials, and it's using that money to finance welfare. And there are more South Africans on welfare than have jobs. So we're very dependent on this world that we live in. And I could see another round of structural adjustment being imposed on African economies, Greek style, if an alternative doesn't emerge. And that's why I think this project that Gary and I are running, and to develop a new economic theory, is really important, because really what I think the Greek crisis represents is finally in a stage which is recognized rather than the African stage which is not recognized. We're seeing in practice the outcome of a bankrupt theory applied in a way which is going to kill the patient, as Demetrios has already said. So I think for me, I agree with Hazel that the Sustainable Development Goals does set up a new paradigmatic framework for thinking in transdisciplinary terms about the economy, which means putting people and the ecology at the center. I think one thing, and just on that, progressive economists seem pretty united that the alternative to what is going on in Greece now is more growth, but of a different kind. So the heterodox economists are still married, I think, too closely to growth, and we need to rethink growth if we are serious about the paradigm shift that Hazel was referring to, and which will be necessary if we're serious about the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we're going to have to recognize that just as the agricultural revolution resulted in a shift in the package of resources that we depended on, in a change of eras, same happened with the Industrial Revolution. We shifted the package of resources that we were dependent on. These are called metabolic revolutions in ecological economics theory. We are now facing a third major metabolic transformation, which is going to have to result in a complete redefinition of the relationship between our economies and the resources that we depend on in the carbon space that we occupy. And that will need to generate an alternative conception of growth. In the African context, that is obviously crucially important, because many African policymakers are realizing that the resource curse is not the basis for sustainable development. But if you go for diversification via investments in infrastructures, the question is, what kind of infrastructures? Are we going to invest in 19th and 20th century technologies to diversify African economies, or are we going to accept that we have to move into 21st century technologies, more renewable, lighter, restorative of nature, and putting people at the center? So in sum, for me, I think that the Greek crisis represents in a very profound way the bankruptcy of a particular paradigm and calls us to really consider the implications, especially the economic theory and policy implications of the Sustainable Development Goals, whose adoption is a momentous event. There's no doubt about it. Thank you, Karen.